Sometimes people call me Nosy Ned because I'm very curious about a lot of things. And one of the things I'd like to find out this evening from you, and I want you to show me by raising your hands, how many of you looked in a mirror before you came to Mass? Almost everybody did. All right, get your hands up. These are mirrors. Look at yourself. What and who do you see? Who do you see in that mirror? Who's standing there? And we know what mirrors do. They reflect back what is in front of them. If we're honest and we look into that mirror, either before we came to Mass or our imaginary ones, who do we see there? Do we see the Pharisee? Or do we see the tax collector? Let's take a moment and talk about these two people. St. Luke tells us they went to the temple to pray. This would have meant they were there at 9 a.m., or 12 noon, or 3 p.m., and we don't know which hour of prayer it was. The Pharisee comes, St. Luke tells us, and offers this prayer to himself. Oh God, I'm so glad I'm not like the rest of these crazy people around here. I'm just better than everybody else. I'm not greedy. I'm not deceitful. I'm not adulterous. Oh, thank God I'm not like them. I'm not even like this tax collector, who of course would not have been a favorite person because many tax collectors were quite dishonest. But this prayer to himself, and look what I do, God. I fast twice a week. Now that would have meant, in the time of this parable, that would have meant Mondays and Thursdays. Those were the days of fasting. And I pay tithes on all of my income. Aren't I great? He's preaching to himself. And he's telling God how God ought to see him. Contrastingly, the tax collector comes to the temple to pray. And he stays back even a bit. He doesn't have the audacity or the courage, perhaps, to even lift his eyes to heaven. And he simply beats his breast and asks God, in your mercy, be good to me, a sinner. How is it we pray to our God? Do we believe, as the reading from Sirach tells us, another name for that book is Ecclesiasticus. Now, translated into English, that means the church book. And these were guidelines for living in the early church. And that portion of that book tells us this evening that God really has no favorites, but God understands the poor, the oppressed, the widow, and the orphan. Those were symbolic people of the abandoned, forgotten, less cared about people. But every prayer, I think this is a beautiful image, pierces the clouds of heaven. You've ever thought about your prayers doing that? I don't think sometimes we think in that image. But our prayers piercing the clouds of heaven. And God, in God's goodness and in God's care, accepts them and he will not delay according to God's time frame to answer us. Paul is writing in this second letter to Timothy near the end of his life. Those images of being poured out like a libation, running the race, keeping the faith, being protected from the lion's mouth, believing deeply that God would take him into the heavenly kingdom. That's a reading that is often used at funerals. So who are we? Are we the Pharisee? Are we the tax collector? I think if we're honest, the answer to those two questions is yes and yes. I think in our broken humanness, we can be both. So we're going to leave the church after our safety drill this evening. You're going to go home and we'll wash our face and brush our teeth or whatever the bedtime rituals are. And we're going to look into a mirror. And tomorrow morning, we're going to get up and say, oh my God, aren't I gorgeous? Some of us will say that. Not all of us. I'm teasing. But we're going to look in the mirror again. And who will we see in that mirror? Will we see the Pharisee or the tax collector? I have an intuition, a bit of both. But on whose sufficiency do we rely? Our own or God's?